Okay, last week we began to explore the topic of our God-given gender identities as men and as women. And we saw three foundational biblical affirmations with regard to our gender identity. This is very quickly by way of review if you didn't hear last week's message. First of all, God created men and women. If we go to the next slide, God created men and women with gender distinctiveness. That is to say, men and women are different by divine design. Nothing really profound there. Second, we saw that our gender distinctiveness is not merely anatomical. That is, the God-designed differences between men and women go beyond the fact that we just have different parts. It's something more than that. We're going to begin to explore that something more this morning. And then thirdly, we saw that gender identity is discovered in God and in community. That is, if we want to know what it is to be a man created in the image of God or a woman created in the image of God, then we discover identity in the one who communicated masculinity to us from the fullness of his being, or communicated femininity to us from the fullness of his own being. And we saw last week then that our distinctive identities in men and women are discovered not only in God, but also in relationship with others, in relationship in community, when we live moral, other-centered, self-sacrificing lives in relationship with others in community. And that the latter part of that statement you're going to see fleshed out more so in today's message. Now, what I want to do is take a quick moment, just as continuing by way of introduction, to answer a question that some of you might be asking. And the question is this, that why have I, in the middle of this mini excursion on sexuality, spent so much time on the topics of intimacy and gender identity? In other words, this question is for those of you who are saying to yourself, when are you actually going to start talking about sex? I'm so disappointed. This whole series on sex and you haven't even talked about sex, right? When are we going to get to the sex part? Well, let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk about sex. This series is about sexuality, and this is the difference, and this is why I'm talking about sexuality. I'm convinced that we, as a culture, and that we, even as a church that has been swept up in the climate of our culture, we've become so sexually messed up, not because we don't have enough information about sex, all right? We have been glutted with information about sex. We're messed up because we have wrongly sexualized intimacy and our identity. And this is what I mean by that. This is just a review of the past several weeks. We've confused authentic intimacy with sexual intensity. And as a result, much of our messed up thinking and messed up behaving sexually is at its core the search to fulfill legitimate God-given needs, but in illegitimate sexual ways. That's the first kind of premise of why we're talking about identity and intimacy, not about sexual mechanics. All right, this is the second reason, is we've confused our identity with our anatomy, and as a result, much of our messed up sexual thinking and sexual behaving is again at its core the search to discover the true, authentic, God-designed self. But again, we're looking for the self in the context of sexualized relationships with others. And again, that's a wrong place to look to find self. And so to summarize, to pull this all together, our compulsion for sex and our obsession with sex are at the core, the search to discover the true self in the legitimate context of authentic intimacy with God and authentic, non-sexualized intimacy with others. But we've confused all that good stuff, we've confused all that with sex, and sex is not all that. But we believe that it is, and that's why we're all messed up about sex. We know more about sex, we've done more different kinds of sex, but we're still starving for intimacy, and we still have no idea what it actually means to be a man or what it actually means to be a woman. and this confusion about intimacy and the brokenness in our identities as men or women created in the image of God, these two things are what lie beneath our struggles with issues like casual promiscuity and unhealthy marriages and perpetual sexual dissatisfaction and adultery and serial divorce and serial remarriage and cohabitation and pornography addiction and gender confusion and homosexuality and sexual abuse. And even beneath such struggles as adult immaturity, childishly boyish men, and childishly girlish women, or weak men and controlling manipulative women, or domineering abusive men and subservient women, or even struggles like insecurity and selfishness and isolation and loneliness, and even suicide are all issues that have beneath them these underlying, confusion about our identity as men and women, and our confusion that authentic intimacy is expressed in sexual intensity. Last week, this is just a quick little ad lib, there was a couple here, Australian couple who are missionaries actually in Pennsylvania. Somebody help me, Pennsylvania. But they had served as missionaries in a red light district. They actually lived in a red light district. I think it was in Sydney, Australia. He told me that they saw an 80% suicide rate among the transsexual population there in Sydney. 80% suicide rate. All right, so what does that tell you? It tells you that our anatomy and that our sexual orientation, our sexual practices are not going to fulfill what the heart is really looking for, right? It's not about sex, it's about something else. And so that's why I'm spending all of our time talking not about sex, but about something else. That's why I'm talking about intimacy and identity in this mini excursion on sexuality. And so with that in mind, what I want to begin to do this morning is look at a biblical portrait of what it looks like for us to be men. Now I have a period now in my notes because it used to say to be men or women created in the image of God. Guess what? I'm only going to cover what it looks like to be a man created in the image of God this morning. I couldn't do both. You guys are really surprised, aren't you? That is so unlike you, Kent. So this is a difficulty, women. I don't know when I'm going to be able to do part 2 of this. All right? I'll do part 2 of this sometime, or Sheldon will actually sometime. But we'll get to it. But it's probably not going to be next week. All right? Are you okay with that? Yeah. Some of you are like, yes. Really okay. Thank you, Kent, for not talking to us about what it means to be a woman. Really appreciate that. All right. And truth be told, I'm not even going to cover everything that I wanted to say this morning about biblical masculinity. But we're going to begin to explore it this morning, a biblical portrait of what it looks like to be a man created in the image of God. And you need to understand this, that I'm using the phrase catching a glimpse of biblical masculinity, a portrait of biblical masculinity intentionally, because the Bible nowhere explicitly says, now this is exactly what it means to be a man created in the image of God. And nowhere does the Bible say explicitly, this is exactly what it looks like to be a female created in the image of God. But I believe that we can catch glimpses of our gender identity as God originally designed them from 2 biblical portraits. The first being, positive affirmations or positive indications in the pre-fall garden. In other words, that is in Genesis 1 and 2, we can catch glimpses of uncorrupted masculinity and glimpses of uncorrupted femininity as God originally designed them before the human race got all messed up through disobeying God. All right? So I believe we can catch a glimpse of masculinity from Genesis 1 and 2. Secondly, we can also capture a glimpse of God-designed masculinity and femininity from negative indications in the post-fall curse. What does that mean? That is to say, in Genesis 3, after the first man and the first woman disobeyed God, God pronounced unique, individualized curses on each gender. Are you aware of that? So if men and women were absolutely no different, if there were not gender distinctiveness, why would God have done that? Wouldn't he have just said, this is the curse on the human race? Because it doesn't matter. There's no difference. Men, women, interchangeable, right? But he didn't do that. He pronounced individualized curses on each gender. And if we understand that each curse was intended by God to frustrate his fundamental design within the man, so that the man would look to God in that place of frustration. And God placed the curses on the woman to frustrate his original design on femininity, so that the woman, in her frustration, would look to God. Then we can gain insight into God's original fundamental design in each gender from the curses that he placed on each gender. Does that make sense? In other words, in the curses God placed upon each gender, God was pushing the very buttons that he built into the man. And he was pushing the very buttons that he built in to the woman for the purpose of awakening in each one a despair that would turn them back to him. And so we can learn how God wired us as men. And we can learn how God wired us originally as women by looking at how he cursed each of our genders in Genesis chapter 3. So that's what is meant by the negative indications from the post-fall curse. And unfortunately, I don't even have time, I think, this morning to get to that. We're just going to spend all of our time talking about point 1, positive indications in the pre-fall curse, or the pre-fall garden for men. I'm just being honest with you. All right, so this is what we're going to do. This morning, we're going to walk our way through the biblical portrait in the Garden of Eden and make some simple observation about biblical masculinity. So men, this is for you. Women, you can just listen. You can throw an elbow every now and again. I give you permission on behalf of the man sitting next to you. All right, Genesis 2:15, we read these words. Then the Lord took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. Just a couple simple observations here. First of all, these words describe the God-given assignment to the first man, to Adam, before God created Eve. This was before God created Eve. And so in the absence of any other human beings, there's just a man on planet Earth. The man found divine purpose in laboring in the world and in moving in the world. That's the first observation. Second observation is these words, the word cultivate literally means to serve. It's where we get the word servant. It means to serve, and the word keep means to guard, to protect, to watch over. So just two observations on, let me just draw a conclusion then about our fundamental God-designed masculinity. This is the sentence we're going to work with, our beginning definition of masculinity. Next slide. So God designed men to move through the world in service and protection. God designed men to move through the world in service and protection. Now we're going to flesh that out a little bit more. That's why, men, we want to fix things. We want to serve. We want to cultivate. We want to see that the work of our hands produces fruitfulness. We want to make things work the way that they're supposed to work. And that's why we get so frustrated when things don't work the way they're supposed to work and we can't fix them. God designed us to serve, to labor, and to move into the world and to guard and watch and protect over it. And that's why, men, we wither when we're not working. It's why we wither when we can't work. It's why we wither when our work seems fruitless or meaningless. It's why a lot of men die when they retire, when they don't occupy themselves in meaningful ways. God hardwired us, men, to move, to work, to labor, to guard and protect in the world. And we also see in these words then, men, why we want them to beat things up. You know, we want to keep, we want to guard, we want to watch over the world. God hardwired us to protect. I was visiting this past Friday. A pastor friend of mine from Chicago was driving through the area. He's got this great story of when he was a young Christian. He was at a Detroit Tigers baseball game, and some drunken redneck kind of guys were picking on an African-American family that were sitting right there in the bleachers with him. And one of the drunk guys ended up throwing just one of those big, baseball stadium beers and hit the woman in the back of the head with a full beer. And my pastor friend, Christian buddy, punched their lights out. He turned around. He tried to talk to them, but then he punched them. All right, now I'm not endorsing that that's the way we should conduct ourselves as Christ followers, but there is something about that reflects the way God hardwired us, men, that there is something wrong in the world, and there's something in our genuine, authentic masculine being that should rise up to protect wrong in the world. Or not protect wrong, but I said that wrong. You know what I meant, though. It is not our job to protect wrong. It is our job to protect right. So anyway, God hardwired us to protect. And lastly, we also see in these words, men, why we're more comfortable in the world of things than we are in the world of people. All right? There were no other people at this point in time. Right? And the man is laboring in the garden, and we're going to see in a minute that he's naming the animals, and we don't know how long this went on. This went on. Adam might have been in the garden working for hundreds of years, thousands of years, 10,000s of years. We don't know. But the man was comfortable in the world of things, in the absence of other people in the world. And so that's why, man, God has hardwired us to find satisfaction in serving and protecting the world of things. And so that's why, women, we are better at trying to fix things than we are at talking about things. All right? It's the way God hardwired us. That's why we can work all day, come home, and still spend the whole night tinkering in the garage. God designed us to be comfortable in the world of things. Now, men, before you find in this verse then justification for being non-relational and being a workaholic, you need to hang in there with me because our definition is going to be modified as we continue. But for the time being, our working definition of biblical masculinity goes something like this. God designed us, men, to move through the world, and move through the world. By that phrase, I mean the things of the world. To move in the world of things, as opposed to relationships, in service and protection. So now we pick up in verse 16 where we read these words. And then the Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. Hey, let me hit the pause button and actually go back. So I've just made the point that, all right, so God hardwired us to be comfortable moving in the world of things, right? And then I said earlier that I wasn't going to talk about the implications from the curse. But what do we know? I'm just going to give you a preview. What do we know from the curse that God proclaimed over men? What was the curse aimed at? Your work. Your work. You will now sweat to produce fruit. You will labor and toil. There was absolutely nothing about the curse aimed on men that was a relational curse. Because God knew I hardwired men to find a sense of satisfaction of moving out into the world and laboring into the world. And now that he's disobeyed me, I've got to do something. I've got to frustrate that desire so that he will look to me. And God said, this is what I'm going to do. I am going to curse. I'm going to frustrate your work. Right? So I think what we see in Genesis 3, the curse placed on men, is it confirms this sense that God wired us, he hardwired us to labor in the world, to serve, to protect in the world of things. All right, that makes sense? All right, that was a tangent. All right, now back to verse 16. So the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die. And so the simple conclusion that I want to draw from these verses about our fundamental God-designed masculinity is that God designed us then, next slide, God designed men to move through the world in service and protection with a moral direction that is bigger than ourselves. With a moral direction that is bigger than ourselves. And so that's why men, the American and Hollywood portrait of the John Wayne type, I am a law unto myself masculinity, is not a portrait of God-designed masculinity. Authentic masculinity is designed to selflessly operate under God's commands and under godly moral authority. All right, so men, listen to this. You show me an unaccountable man who doesn't answer to anyone, who marches to the beat of his own drummer, and I will show you a man who isn't a man, biblically speaking. That is a distortion of masculinity. That is an American caricature of masculinity, but it is not at all biblical masculinity. Because when our moral compass, men, is not set on God's truth, on God's true north, then our compass will inevitably point to ourselves. It's either going to point to God or it's going to point to ourselves. And if it's pointing to ourselves, then we will inevitably choose that which is in our self-interest. And that is a complete perversion of authentic masculinity, which God designed to move out into the world, not to move inwardly, to move out into the world, to serve and protect. And so men, when we are living lives in self-serving, self-centered ways, driven by, I will do what is right for me to serve my needs, to protect me, we are living beneath our design specs. That's not what the designer called for. God designed us, men, to move into the world, to move through the world in service and protection with a moral compass, with a moral direction that is bigger than ourselves. Understood? All right. Let's pick back up in verse 18. Next slide. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. So after hundreds, thousands, 10,000s of years of laboring, of naming the animals, as we'll see in a moment, God said, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. And so the Lord formed from the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky, and he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And the man chose a name for each one, and he gave names to all the livestock, all the birds of the sky, and all the wild animals. I suspect that took a while. But still, there was no helper just right for him. So a couple simple observations from this portrait of fundamental God-designed masculinity. First, we see that although God hardwired men to be satisfied in the world of things, even still, God said it's not good for the man to be alone. God hardwired us to be satisfied in the world of things, but even still said it's not good for us to be alone. It's not good, men, for us to be relationally isolated. It's not good. So once again, the John Wayne, and maybe that's a dated analogy. I don't know. Who's our John Wayne equivalent? Is it like Bruce Willis or... Yeah, Bruce Willis. Die hard again. Continue to keep dying. All right, so anyway, the point is this John Wayne, Bruce Willis, rugged American independent, I am a rock, I am an island unto myself, caricature of masculinity, is a thoroughly unbiblical masculinity. God himself has said over us men, it is not good for us to be relationally isolated. Why? Because in isolation, we become self-centered and self-serving. In isolation from serving and protecting the world of things and the world of relationships now, we become something less than men. All right, that's the first observation from these verses. We also observe in these verses that God himself God himself invited the man to participate with him in calling out the identities of creation. All right? God himself gave the man the job of naming the animals. Bear, lion. I've talked about this in sermons in the past. But there's a couple implications that we can draw about then the way God hardwired men. First of all, God designed us men to move in the world confidently. In confident participation, in a sense of having a divine purpose in serving and protecting the world. In other words, to move in the world confidently because I know that I'm doing what God wired me to do. Understand? Confidence in knowing that I'm doing what God wired me to do. And secondly, God desired men then to confidently participate with him in calling out the identity of his created order, of calling out identity in the world. In other words, having a confidence in knowing that God has authorized and empowered a man's voice to speak identity in cooperation with God into his created order. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So the two things I'm wanting you to see is confidence in a godly purpose and confidence in participation with the Lord in calling identity out of the created order. So let's modify our working definition then to this. So God designed men to confidently move through the world in service and protection and participative identification, meaning participating with the Lord and calling out the identity of the created order and doing that with a moral direction, a moral compass that is bigger than ourselves. So let me give you an illustration of what that all might look like. So if you could imagine for this first man, for Adam, a voice that would have said to him, now, who in the world do you think that you are to serve creation, to protect creation, to identify and call out the names of creation? I mean, how in the world, man, can you be sure that that's a bear? Who in the world gave you the permission, the authority to do that? And the first man would have said, well, God. And so, bear. It's a bear. You see that? That's confidence in a divine purpose. It's confidence in a divine calling. And it's confidence in participating with God, of cooperating with the Lord, to calling out the identities of those things that exist in the creative order. And that, listen to this, that biblical portrait of biblical masculinity stands in stark contrast to the uncertain and insecure and purposeless expressions of masculinity that are so prevalent today. And that portrait of biblical masculinity stands in stark contrast to the domineering, manipulative, controlling, closed-fisted, it's my way or the highway expressions of masculinity that are so prevalent today, which in and of themselves are still nothing more than uncertainty and insecurity and purposelessness masquerading as manliness. So God designed us men to confidently move through the world. Confidence in a sense of divine calling. Confidence in a sense of divine purpose. He designed us to confidently move through the world in service and in protection and now in participative identification and calling out the names of the created order around us and doing that with a moral direction which is larger than ourselves. All right, so far so good? All right, let's add just a little bit more to this working definition. When we keep reading in verse 21, we're going to see this participative identification component of biblical masculinity extended beyond the world of things now to the world of people. All right? This is where, men, we're now on the hook for not just tinkering with things, but now God places on us the responsibility in relationships. All right? So let's pick up verse 21. And so after the man had been for who knows how long cultivating the garden, naming the animals, says the Lord finally caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while the man slept, the Lord took out one of the man's ribs and closed up the opening. And then the Lord God made a woman from the rib, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, "At last," the man exclaimed, this one. You're going to hear the calling out identity. This one is bone from my bone and flesh from my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken from man. And this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. And this last phrase, which I preached on a couple weeks ago, and now the man and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. All right, this is what I want you to see here, is that not only did the man participate with God in calling out the God-given identities of the animals, but the man also now here participated with God in calling out the identity of the woman, in some sense, the whole rest of the human race, of the human community. All right, so listen to this. It is the man's voice by God's design that in participation with him that calls out the God-given identities of the created order, including the human community. That is God's design. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is the man's voice by God's design that in participation with him that calls out the God-given identity of the human community. Right? And we see that God intended for the man's voice to do that, to call out the identity of the woman, to call out, this is who you are. And it's God's design, men, that we do that in a way that is safe. The first man in these verses, if we go back to the other side, the man in these verses started calling the woman names. As she stood before him completely vulnerable with the whole of her naked self exposed, and he starts calling her names, and when it was all said and done, she was still standing before him completely naked, completely exposed, and completely unashamed. That is who I am. This is who I am. God hardwired us, men, to shamelessly name call the people around us. To shamelessly name call the people around us so that they can stand in the world in the fullness of their wholly exposed naked selves, confident in who God created them to be without shame. Do you hear that? And that's why, man, our words have power. God hardwired us that way so that a man's voice in cooperation with God can call shameless manhood out of boys. And so that a man's voice in cooperation with God can call womanhood out of daughters. And that's why a man's voice, men, can be so shaming and so damaging. We can call out names that destroy life, that confuse the identity of men and women and boys and girls around us. And we can call out a broken image, and we can call out a distorted image. And that's why the absence of a man's voice can be so shaming and damaging. The absence of a man's voice, you understand what I'm saying here? Because there was nothing in the absence of a man's voice to name us. There was nothing to name us. And so that's why many of us have no idea who we are as men and women. Some of us did not have a man's voice participating with God, helping us to discover who we were as boys or who we were as girls. Or we had fathers or men in our lives who passively spoke nothing into us. They spoke nothing over us, leaving us insecure and unconfident and uncertain and ashamed of who we are as men or women. Or we had fathers or men in our lives who shamed us with their words, and they called out of us just a hideous, reflection of ourselves, a grotesque reflection of ourselves, an unlovable reflection of ourselves. Or we had fathers or men in our lives who, in their own deficit of identity, in their own absence of authentic masculinity, instead of serving us and protecting us and naming us, they abused a false sense of masculinity for themselves out of our flesh. The very voice that was supposed to be participating with God in launching us as a whole person into the world became the voice that produced in us brokenness and confusion and uncertainty and insecurity. That is why, men, so many of us are looking to our wives or looking to women to call masculinity out of us, because we never got it from a man's voice that should have called masculinity out of us. And because we've sexualized masculinity, we're looking to our wives or we're looking to women to call masculinity out of us, but it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because God did not hardwire the woman's voice to call out masculinity. A woman's presence can affirm masculinity, but a woman's voice cannot call out masculinity. That is not the way God designed it. Masculinity is called out of us, men, by the voice of God speaking to the voices of fathers, speaking to the voices of men. And that's why your wife, men, or that's why women, men, cannot say enough words and will never be able to say enough words to create a sense of manhood in you where one does not exist. Some of you women know what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter what I say. I cannot speak that manhood into my husband, into my boyfriend. The woman's voice, God did not design to call masculinity out of boys. Men, that is why your wife or any other woman can't give you enough sex to make you feel like a man. Masculinity is not called out through sex. But we believe that it is, and that's why we become selfish, self-centered, self-serving, self-gratifying boys who are ever demanding to hear from women. We're ever demanding to hear from women, but we're never satisfied in hearing, "Hey, big guy, you've pleased me." Because what we really need to hear is the Father's voice speaking through fathers. "Hey, big guy, in you I am well pleased." And that's a completely different sentence. The latter one is the one we need to hear. All right, so let's go back to our working definition here. I could just keep going on that stuff. So God designed men to confidently move through the world in service and protection and participative identification with a moral direction that is bigger than ourselves. To confidently move, just have a sense of God has called me. God has put a purpose on my life to move into the world, to serve the world, to protect the world, to call out, to use the masculine voice that God has placed within me, to call out the identity of my son, to call out the identities of our daughters, to call out the identity of our wives, so that they can shamelessly discover who God created them to be. And that we do with a moral direction which is larger than ourselves, responding to the drumbeat of God's godly morality. That is authentic masculinity. All right, I think I'll wrap up there. Let's stand.